The rainforests of South America are often described as living organisms. From above, they appear calm, endless waves of green stretching toward the horizon. But inside, the jungle breathes, listens, and waits. 9-year-old John had no way of knowing that a simple family trip into this vast wilderness would turn into one of the most disturbing and widely discussed wildlife incidents the continent had seen in years. John's parents believed they were doing something right. They wanted their son to experience nature beyond screens and city streets. The tour company advertised the journey as safe, guided, and educational. A professional local guide would lead them through a well-known forest trail, far from dangerous zones. Thousands of tourists had walked the same path before. Nothing had ever gone wrong. That morning, the jungle welcomed them with thick mist and warm air. Sunlight barely pierced through towering trees, creating shifting shadows on the forest floor. Birds called loudly, insects buzzed, and the sound of distant water echoed through the vegetation. John was fascinated. He carried a small handheld camera recording everything, from strange plants to brightly colored insects clinging to leaves. As the group moved deeper, the guide slowed his pace. The trail narrowed near a riverbank where the water moved slowly but powerfully. The guide raised his hand and spoke firmly. "We stop here. No one approaches the water." He explained that rivers in this region were unpredictable. Visibility was poor, and many animals used the banks as hunting grounds. John listened, but curiosity pulled him in another direction. He lagged behind, only a few steps. In a jungle like this, a few steps are enough to disappear. Near the muddy edge of the river, something caught his eye. A massive imprint pressed deep into the wet soil. It didn't look like anything he had seen before. When the guide noticed the mark, his expression changed slightly. He said it could belong to a large snake, possibly an anaconda. Then he added something that would later echo in everyone's mind. They usually avoid humans. Usually. Moments later, the jungle fell silent. Birds vanished. Insects stopped. John's camera continued recording as the forest held its breath. Anacondas do not behave like predators people see in movies. They do not roar, chase, or dramatize their presence. Their danger comes from silence and patience. For hours, sometimes days, they remain completely motionless, allowing their surroundings to forget they exist. In muddy rivers and slow-moving waters, their bodies become indistinguishable from fallen logs or dark vegetation. John did not see a snake. He did not feel fear. He simply noticed the water was closer than expected. He crouched near the riverbank, annoyed by the thick mud clinging to his shoes. The air was heavy and the forest felt strangely still. That stillness was not peace. It was awareness. The jungle had already registered movement. A subtle ripple disturbed the surface of the water. John paused. His brain tried to understand what his eyes were seeing, but there was no context for it. Children are not wired to interpret danger in environments they trust. Then instinct met instinct. The anaconda reacted to vibration and proximity, not hunger, not intent, pure reflex. Its body launched upward with terrifying efficiency, muscles contracting with a force humans cannot comprehend. The guide shouted, but sound travels slower than motion. For John's family, time fractured. Seconds stretched into something unrecognizable. The guide rushed forward, striking the water repeatedly, yelling, doing everything training had taught him. Yet none of it mattered. Once an anaconda commits to constriction, interference often worsens the outcome. Calls for help were made through a radio that crackled more than it transmitted. Forest authorities responded immediately, but terrain does not bend to urgency. By the time assistance was even theoretically possible, the jungle had already decided the outcome. The anaconda slipped back into the river, vanishing beneath the surface as if it had never been there at all. What remained was not just absence, but shock. The forest slowly resumed its sounds, birds returned, insects buzzed again. Nature moved on, indifferent to human devastation. That indifference would soon collide with human outrage. The news traveled faster than anyone expected. Within hours, local media had turned the incident into breaking news. By the next day, international outlets were repeating the same cold sentence. A child had died in a rare wildlife attack. But rarity did not matter to the public. Social media became a battlefield. Some demanded vengeance, others demanded accountability. A short, unstable video recovered from John's camera circulated endlessly. Grainy jungle sounds, confusion, then nothing. It was enough to ignite imaginations and inflame fear. People wanted certainty in a situation that offered none. Authorities faced immediate pressure. Politicians demanded answers. Conservationists demanded restraint. Tour companies feared collapse. Parents around the world questioned whether nature tourism was reckless by default. And above all else, one question dominated every discussion. Was the anaconda going to be killed? Experts attempted to calm the situation. They explained that anacondas are not man-eaters. They do not target humans. Incidents like this occur when boundaries collapse, when humans enter spaces governed entirely by wild rules. Those explanations failed to soothe public emotion. Search efforts intensified, rangers patrolled riverbanks. Thermal cameras scanned waterways. Drones hovered above areas once considered inaccessible, yet the snake was nowhere to be found. With each passing day, anxiety grew. People feared the animal had learned something, that it might strike again, that it now associated humans with prey. None of that was true, but fear does not require truth to grow. Then after nearly a week, the river revealed movement again. The sighting did not come with drama. There were no helicopters hovering dramatically above the river, no sudden heroic intervention. Instead, it came quietly, through a radio transmission from a patrol team stationed miles downstream. A ranger had spotted an unusually large anaconda resting near a shallow curve of the river, its massive body partially exposed where the water slowed and widened. Coordinates were shared immediately. Within minutes, experts, wildlife officers, and government officials were involved. Measurements taken from a distance suggested the snake was enormous, close to 8 meters in length. The size alone narrowed the possibilities. There were not many anacondas in the region capable of reaching such proportions. The likelihood that this was the same animal grew stronger with every passing hour. But identifying the snake was only the beginning. The real conflict had nothing to do with tracking or biology. It was about decision-making. Public pressure was relentless. Politicians demanded decisive action. News outlets framed the situation as a test of authority. Social media called for punishment, as if the anaconda were a criminal rather than a wild animal acting on instinct. At the same time, conservationists warned that killing the snake would violate international wildlife protection agreements and do nothing to prevent future incidents. An emergency council was assembled. Veterinarians, herpetologists, legal experts, and senior forest officials debated for hours. The discussion was not calm. Voices were raised, emotions surfaced. Everyone understood that whatever decision was made would define how similar cases would be handled for decades. In the end, a narrow consensus was reached. The anaconda would be captured alive if possible. Lethal force would only be authorized if human life was in immediate danger during the operation. The plan was executed at dawn. Teams approached slowly using boats designed to minimize vibration. Tranquilizers were prepared with extreme caution. Dosage calculations for an animal of that size carried significant risk. Too little would provoke aggression. Too much could stop the animal's heart. When the tranquilizer finally took effect, the anaconda's movements slowed. Its breathing became visible. The jungle, as if aware of the gravity of the moment, fell unnaturally quiet. No one cheered. The snake lay there, immense and still, not monstrous, not threatening, just alive. As it was secured and prepared for transport, one of the senior veterinarians reportedly said something that never made it into official reports. "This animal doesn't know it's at the center of human grief." The anaconda was relocated to a restricted wildlife reserve, far from any tourist routes or human settlements. The location was kept confidential to prevent attention and exploitation. The official statement released hours later was short and carefully worded. The animal would not be euthanized. The backlash was immediate. Some called it a betrayal. Others called it justice. Many could not understand how an animal involved in a child's death could be allowed to live. Yet for the authorities, the decision was final. John's family was informed privately before the announcement. They offered no public response, no interview, no statement. Their silence echoed louder than any protest. The jungle had acted without intent. Humans had acted with choice. And that difference would haunt the aftermath. After the anaconda was transported out of the region, something strange happened. Nothing else happened. No new sightings. No further incidents. No dramatic aftermath the public had expected. The jungle did not erupt into chaos, and the river did not become more dangerous. It continued flowing the same way it always had, as if the events of the previous weeks had never occurred. But for humans, the silence was heavy. The reserve where the anaconda was relocated was placed under strict restrictions. Access was limited to a small number of specialists responsible for monitoring its health and behavior. There were no signs of increased aggression, no changes in feeding patterns, no abnormalities. Every report reached the same conclusion. The animal was behaving exactly as a wild anaconda should. This finding quietly dismantled many of the fears that had fueled public anger. The snake had not learned anything. It had not become dangerous in a new way. It had simply reacted once, in a moment when human presence crossed an invisible line. Authorities began implementing changes not because the jungle demanded them, but because people needed reassurance. Tour routes near rivers were permanently altered. New distance regulations were introduced. Guides were trained to treat silence, not sound, as the first warning sign. Children were no longer allowed near water edges under any circumstances, regardless of supervision. None of these rules brought comfort to John's family. They returned home away from cameras and public discussion. There was no lawsuit, no public campaign, no attempt to assign blame. Friends later said the family understood something most people refused to accept. Nothing illegal had happened, nothing malicious had occurred, and yet everything had gone wrong. Over time, John's name stopped appearing in headlines. The internet moved on, as it always does, but in the region where it happened, his name became part of training manuals, safety briefings, and quiet conversations between guides before entering the forest. "Remember what happened here," they would say. Not to scare tourists, but to remind themselves. The anaconda remains alive to this day, isolated, unseen, and largely forgotten by the public. There is no plaque, no sign, no marker acknowledging its role in the incident. Because nature does not carry guilt, and it does not carry memory the way humans do. What this story left behind was not a villain, not a lesson about cruelty, and not proof that nature is hostile. It left behind a boundary, a reminder that wild places do not adapt to human emotion, that they do not bend to tragedy, and that they do not distinguish between intention and consequence. The jungle did not change its rules that day. Humans simply encountered them too closely. Somewhere in South America, a river still runs through dense forest. Tourists pass it from a distance now. The water looks calm, harmless, ordinary. And unless you know the story, you would never guess that a single moment there reshaped how an entire region understands the line between curiosity and respect. That line is still there, unmarked, unforgiving,